What's in
The hunt is on for a serial killer who's preying on young men. Investigators have a plan to catch him, but will he take the bait?
Made contact.
At first, it looked like a bungled burglary, but Maryland detectives could see the motive was murder. To solve it, they must establish which clues are real. Industrial parks in western Florida have become a killer's dumping ground. How many more women will die before authorities put him out of business? For some people, killing might come easy, but getting away with it seldom is. No matter how a murderer tries to cover his crimes, there will always be something left at the scene. Charlotte County, Florida, April 17, 1996. Two county road inspectors took a break from their duties to set up hog traps along a popular but secluded hunting trail.
Man,
What they found were the remains of someone else's
that
prey,
ain't what we're looking for.
a human skull. They notified the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. It was up to the forensics team to gather together what time and animals had scattered through the woods. Besides more remains, they looked for clothing, a weapon, or anything else that might help them determine the identity of the victim and how he or she came to be there. All investigators found was a single pink fiber near the skull. But it paled in comparison to what was discovered next. 50 yards from where the skull was found, an investigator spotted a roll of carpet padding. Inside was a male body, but it wasn't the body he expected to find. This one had a head. He was a second victim, more recent than the first, probably killed within the last few days. Less compromised by the elements, this second victim provided a second opportunity for usable clues. Rope fibers clung to a nearby tree, and additional lengths of rope were found strewn in the woods. A single tiny paint chip was lifted off the body. According to Jim Myers of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, these murder scenarios are the hardest kind of cases to solve.
It's not like a traditional crime where, you're in a house or whatever and you've got credit cards, you can find out who that is, do associates, neighborhood checks, and that type of thing. It doesn't work that way when you just get a body out in the woods.
A few feet from the first victim's skull, investigators found what remained of his torso. Though the body was badly decomposed, they were able to discern an unusual tattoo on his shoulder. It was their only hope of identifying him. Authorities relied on the media for help. That night, the news broadcast the photo of the tattoo, hoping someone might recognize it and identify the victim. Someone did. A woman phoned the police and said it looked like the tattoo worn by her brother, 25-year-old Kenny Smith. She told authorities that she hadn't heard from him in some time. Though he lived much of the time on the street, he'd recently seen the dentist, who provided up-to-date dental records. From them, investigators confirmed the remains found in the woods were Kenny Smith's.
Yes.
Investigators still had the other victim found in the carpet padding to identify. At autopsy, the body was determined to be a white male in his 20s. No one had reported anyone matching his description as missing in the county. The body was vacuumed to collect stray fibers and other trace evidence that might be clinging to it. Then the body was examined. Ligature marks scarred it in several places, mostly around his neck and genital region. He had been strangled to death by rope. Afterward, the killer had removed his genitals with a scalpel or sharp knife. Clearly the act of a twisted yet methodical mind. The victim had been dead approximately 1 day, and his fingerprints were still readable. From them, he was determined to be 21-year-old Richard Montgomery.
All
right, let's do.
Montgomery and Smith were not the first young white males found dead in the woods of southwest Florida.
Yo, Rick, looks like we got something over here.
Okay, no.
Between 1994 and 1996, 3 others had been found in the woods of Charlotte and Sarasota counties. Fearing they were dealing with a serial killer, Chief Investigator Rick Hobbs called in a criminal profiler.
He reviewed the evidence that we had and basically confirmed that in his opinion, he felt that the same person was responsible for all these murders. And he described the person as possibly a sexual sadist.
Someone was preying on male drifters. And like some of his victims, he had no name. Because his latest victims were found on the hog hunting trail, the press called him the Hog Trail Killer. To coordinate efforts across jurisdictions, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement formed a task force with the Charlotte County Sheriff's Department and the Northport Police. Special Agent Jim Myers led the task force. They hadn't a minute to waste.
We're talking with a person that basically is on keep killing unless we stop them, and that's the primary reason to get a task force. We have the situation we had to get as many people as we could involved to prevent it from happening again. You know, our primary mission is to get the bad guy, but what we also have to do is protect the public safety.
The mysterious serial killings received wide publicity. Soon, it paid off. Donald Perry, an inmate at a state prison in Florida, had seen a news report and told authorities he might have been a potential victim of the killer. Perry said that a man approached him in a park and offered him $150 to pose nude in the woods. He said the pictures would involve bondage, that he'd be tied to a tree. They'd be Polaroids, so he wouldn't have to worry about the negatives being sold. The man, whose name was Dan, seemed very gentle, and Perry needed the money, so he took the job. On the way to the woods, the car got stuck in the mud on a secluded road. Some passers-by helped them free it while Perry steered.
All right, come on, let's go.
That was when Perry noticed the kit Dan had prepared for the photo shoot. The ropes, knife, and gloves made him fear for his life. As soon as the car was freed, Perry hit the gas.
Glasses was the guy I saw on TV.
A few hours later, he was arrested for stealing it. The scenario fit the profile closely enough for investigators to check the theft report. Investigators learned the theft report was filed by a man named Daniel Conahan and his father, who owned the vehicle. The task force took the lead and ran with it. They set up surveillance on Conahan. The 43-year-old registered nurse lived with his parents in Charlotte County. His nursing training recalled the clinical precision the killer used to mutilate one of the victims. Police photographed Conahan talking to and following drifters in his car. That was no crime. However, it was suspicious, and for the task force, an opportunity. They sent an undercover officer to pose as a decoy. They met several times as the decoy built Conahan's trust. The detective wore a body wire to record their conversations. Conahan eventually asked the detective to pose for pictures in the woods. Hoping Conahan would open up and say more, the undercover detective asked him to his camp in the woods, which was already staked out by a SWAT team. The detective had his agenda to gather evidence. But Conahan didn't cooperate. As the detective continued asking questions, Conahan lost interest. Investigators came away with only circumstantial evidence and nothing to warrant an arrest. If Daniel Conahan was a sadistic serial killer, he remained free to stalk new prey.
Last week on the 16th.
Police in Florida were on the trail of Daniel Conahan, suspected serial killer. But they had no real evidence. In June, 2 months after the last two murders were discovered, a Fort Myers police officer recalled a case from 3 years earlier. It was similar to an incident recently reported by an inmate named Donald Perry. Once again, it was a prisoner who held the key. Stanley Burden, serving time in Ohio, had a story to tell.
What happened to you?
It had a familiar ring. He said that he'd met a man outside a hamburger joint in Fort Myers who offered him money to be tied up in the woods and photographed. He said the guy's name was Dan. Needing the cash, Burden consented. Dan asked him to remove some clothes and then began tying him to a tree with clothesline he cut with a pair of pliers. The situation quickly spun out of control. Once Burden was immobilized, Dan began tightening the ropes around his neck. When they were sufficiently tight, Dan left him and never returned. Burden eventually freed himself. He was able to describe Dan's car, and more importantly, he picked Dan Conahan's picture out of a photo lineup. Based on this, investigators were able to arrest Conahan for the assault and attempted murder of Stanley Burden.
Basically a great relief for us at the task force because we was able to get him off the street earlier by the crime that he committed on Burton and be able to proceed in putting our cases together on the murders.
Investigators were a long way from proving Conahan was the serial killer they were looking for. That required more tangible proof. They obtained a warrant to search the home he shared with his parents. Forensic examiners collected fibers from carpets, bedding, and furniture. Each specimen was carefully tagged, packaged, and sent off to the crime lab for analysis. Conahan's automobile was searched as well. Besides an assortment of carpet and upholstery fibers, technicians also collected a chip of paint from the car's peeling exterior. They needed to compare it to the one found on the body of Richard Montgomery, one of the two young men found along the hog trail. Hoping to find more incriminating evidence against their suspect, investigators subpoenaed Conahan's credit card records for the previous 3 years. To investigators, Items listed on the statements suggested Conahan was stocking and restocking a murder kit.
On the 16th of April, we found where just before Mr. Montgomery disappeared, some of the items, pliers, rope, knife, and I believe a tarp, was purchased that afternoon.
The items were purchased at a store just down the street from where Richard Montgomery lived. While the credit card records were being scrutinized, the fiber and paint samples were analyzed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement lab. Several fibers collected from Conahan's house matched fibers gathered at the crime scene. Next, the paint chip from Conahan's car was analyzed to see if it matched the chip found clinging to one of the victims. A tiny chip of paint can hold volumes of information. First, it's looked at to determine how many layers of paint are present, their colors, and their thickness. Both the sample from the car and the specimen from the murder scene consisted of 4 layers of paint of matching colors and thickness. Microanalyst Jan Taylor needed to determine if the 2 chips chemically matched.
In doing my microchemical examinations, I take small peels of each layer within the paint sample and apply a solvent or reagent to it to see how the paint reacts to the solvent or reagent. And I perform this on the question paint recovered from the victim as well as the known paint samples removed from the vehicle. And in doing so, I did determine that these paints indeed were like one another at this step of my examination.
And that brought detectives one step closer to making their case against Conahan. But still not close enough. Taylor had more work to do. She used infrared radiation to analyze the chemical binders in the paint samples. Then a scanning electron microscope revealed the pigments. In a process called energy dispersive X-ray analysis, the samples are bombarded with X-rays, causing them to throw off electrons. These electrons reveal the elements that the paint pigments are made from. In all these tests, the paint chips matched.
The conclusion that I reached following these tests were that the question paint chip removed from the victim originated from this vehicle.
The paint chip found on Richard Montgomery's body had come from Daniel Conahan's car. Science had made its case against Conahan. According to the evidence, Conahan lured Richard Montgomery into the woods for a bogus photo shoot. Once he had Montgomery where he wanted him, Conahan tortured and killed him. The jury deliberated only around 20 minutes before sentencing the Hog Trail killer to death. Daniel Conahan sought out his victims and lured them to their deaths. Other killers are less meticulous. They strike closer to home and kill on the spot. 70 miles from Baltimore, Hagerstown, Maryland is a typical American community and a good place to raise kids. A place where some folks don't feel the need to lock their doors, at least most of the time. On Valentine's Day, 1995, Deborah and Tim Massey's twin sons came home from school and found themselves locked out. That was unusual. Deborah was always home to greet her 8-year-olds. They went to the garage behind their house where their father, Tim Massey, ran a towing company. Their dad wasn't around, so they asked an employee, Darrell Mosier, if he'd seen their mother. He took the boys back to the house and tried knocking. He got no response.
Deborah?
The broken window caused him some concern.
Hey, let's go on over to Grandma's house.
Boys, how are you? So good.
Tim Massey was out on a job, So Mosier brought the boys to their grandmother, who lived nearby.
They said they couldn't get in the house.
She called Deborah's house. Still, no answer.
Thank you.
Sensing that something had to be wrong, Darrell Mosier returned to the house and entered. And there he found Deborah Massey collapsed on the living room floor. She wasn't breathing. He phoned the police.
Hagerstown City Police.
He reported that someone appeared to have broken in, but the doors were still locked. Detective George Brandt of the Hagerstown Police questioned that scenario.
We were advised that all the doors were locked, both the front door and the back doors of the residence. And we thought that was odd. I mean, somebody go ahead and murder someone and leave the residence and locking the doors.
Deborah Massey always left the doors open so that her kids could get in when they came home from school. The locked doors were just the first of several strange clues investigators found. The next clue was attached to the television, where forensic scientist Jeff Kercheval found a strange note.
It said, "Your husband is next. I need money." Now, here we have someone writing a note to a dead person, a person that they had just killed. It would make more sense if they were writing the note to the husband to say, "You are next," and give their name. For example, Tim. "Tim, you are next. I need money."
But whoever scribbled this bizarre note to a dead woman apparently didn't need money that badly after all. He'd ransacked the house, but left behind the victim's jewelry and even some cash. This bungled burglary was looking more like a sloppy murder in disguise. Maryland investigators on the scene of a murder initially believed the motive was robbery. But on closer inspection, it seemed nothing of value had been taken. Along with fiber samples, they picked up shards of glass from the broken window. A cigarette butt was collected from a trash can. Mrs. Massey was not a smoker. The house had no ashtrays, lighters, matches, or cigarettes.
Sent that off to the Secret Service.
Investigators believe that the killer must have left this cigarette butt behind. Deborah Massey, who had recently filed for divorce from her husband, Tim, lived in the house with her twins. By all accounts, she was a devoted mom who stayed active in her children's lives. Though Tim Massey had moved to an apartment, he still operated the towing service out of the backyard of the house. While the crime scene was being investigated, detectives reviewed Darrell Mosier's statement. Mosier claimed that Tim Massey arrived for work at around 10:30 a.m., stayed about 10 minutes, then left. Around 11:45, Massey returned. Mosier saw him walking towards the house. Mosier said that Massey returned a few minutes later. They spoke briefly, and then Massey left again. Mosier left for lunch shortly thereafter. Mosier said he didn't see Deborah at all. An examination of the property demonstrated that the only way to get to the back door was to pass by the garage. Mosier said he saw nobody pass there except for Tim Massey. But Massey never stayed for any length of time.
So what I'll do is
A check of Mosier's statement established his whereabouts for the entire day and dismissed him as a suspect.
Thank you.
So whatever happened at the Massey house happened while Mosier was away for lunch. At the killer's point of entry, investigators found a toolbox. Inside was a hammer with glass particles clinging to it, probably used to break the window. As the investigation at the house continued, Tim Massey arrived. He said his mother contacted him when Darrell Mosier brought the kids over and said that the house had been broken into. Police informed him of his wife's murder and took him to the station for questioning. As a husband going through a bitter divorce, Tim Massey was automatically a suspect, especially since he was seen at the house that morning. He cooperated fully with police. He handed over the contents of his pockets, which included ink pens. He gave them his clothes for forensic analysis. It was standard procedure for proving someone's innocence. Tim Massey acknowledged that the couple had a rocky relationship. Deborah had filed for divorce 2 weeks earlier and had also filed a protective order against Tim. He and his employees were not allowed in the home.
7 o'clock.
What time did you go to Bob's?
7.
Massey stated that he'd been at the garage once that morning. He went to check on one of the twins who'd been sick.
What time did you leave?
The information helped Detective George Brandt piece together Massey's whereabouts that morning.
11:15.
So he was interested in the one boy, seeing how he was doing. And of course he learned when he got there, and this was between 10 and 10:30 that morning, that his boy had gone to school and he was doing all right.
So, Mr. Massey, can you tell me where you were?
He told police that Deborah had met him on the porch.
What time did you get there?
Massey insisted he hadn't been inside the house in weeks. After leaving the house, he went to one of the police impound lots that he towed vehicles to. Around 1 o'clock, Massey called the police to report that someone had stolen the wheels off one of the cars he was storing for the police. The officer met him at the lot at 1:18.
People come out here, take all my stuff.
They were there until 1:50, when they both went to the police station. Massey was friendly with the police because he did some towing work for them. He said he wanted to go to the station to say hello.
And I imagine he was in here for a good half hour, maybe a little longer, just talking to people down there on the first floor.
We already interviewed.
Investigators had to consider that Deborah Massey was killed randomly by a stranger. According to Detective Bill Rourke, investigators hit the streets to see if anyone could report anything suspicious.
We did neighborhood canvasses. Anyone who saw anything unusual was brought into police headquarters and a statement was obtained from them. All of Mr. Massey's employees were brought into police headquarters and statements were obtained from them. We interviewed family members. We interviewed anyone at all who was willing to talk to us, who had any information at all.
Despite their efforts, police turned up nothing. Nobody had any useful information to share. No one had seen anything suspicious. While police canvassed neighborhoods, Deborah Massey underwent an autopsy. Examiners concluded that she was murdered sometime between 11:15 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. From the markings on her throat, it was clear that she was manually strangled to death. Forensic scientist Jeff Kercheval noticed something significant about the markings.
I had investigated 2 other cases involving manual strangulation within the past 6 months. And in all those cases, there were tiny crescent-shaped abrasions over the surface of the neck and the face area where the individual had used their hands to strangle them. In this case, with Debbie Massey, none of those markings were present. And in the interview room with Mr. Massey, I noted that he was a nail biter and had very, very short fingernails.
11:15, 11.
Nail biting is not a punishable offense, and it certainly didn't prove Tim Massey was the killer.
Mr. Massey, could you stand up and...
Investigators looked for every possible way to eliminate him as a suspect. But Tim Massey couldn't account for all of his movements during the time in which the murder had occurred. They felt there were too many unanswered questions regarding Tim Massey. They hoped to find answers at his apartment.
Mr. Massey, could we have your clothes?
Investigators believed that Tim Massey might know more about his wife's murder than he was letting on. He gave his consent to search his apartment. In the hamper, investigators recovered a pair of trousers, In the cuffs were small fragments of glass. This was the first piece of incriminating evidence against Tim Massey. When he had arrived at the house, officers kept him at a safe distance to prevent contamination of the crime scene. It was unlikely that he came in contact with the glass on the porch at that time. But for the fragments found on his pants to be true physical evidence, they needed to be tested. The fibers and the glass collected from the pants were compared against samples taken from the murder scene. They matched. The lab also tested the ink from the pens that Massey handed over during his interview.
Whenever a manufacturer manufactures a new lot of ink, they send a representative sample to the Secret Service. At that particular point in time, they had somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,000 different inks in their reference library.
The ink on the note matched none of the database samples, suggesting that it was a generic brand. The odds of matching it to a specific pen grew even slimmer than 7,000 to 1. And yet, one of Tim Massey's pens had exactly the same chemical characteristics as the ink on the note found at the scene. But the most indelible mark of Massey's guilt was the freshly smoked cigarette found at the crime scene. It was Tim Massey's brand, and more precisely, his DNA was on it. That conclusively placed him at the scene and caught him in a blatant lie.
Mr. Massey continuously denied that he was in the house during this day or for several weeks prior to that. If he would have placed himself in the house, that would have not been strange to us due to the fact he used to be married to the lady, they were going through a divorce, and he had 2 children that lived there. But he was adamant that he had not been in the house.
Not only had Tim Massey been there that day, he also killed there. On September 20th, 1995, Tim Massey was arrested for the murder of his wife, Deborah. From what police could determine, Massey, who was seeing another woman, realized that if Deborah divorced him, she would be entitled to half of his assets, including the towing business he had built from scratch. It would mean selling the business and starting over. Massey had a different plan. Sometime between noon and 1 p.m., Massey entered his wife's house through the unlocked door and strangled her. Then he wrote the note and staged the robbery. He knew his kids would come home from school, and he didn't want them to find their mother's body, so he locked the door on his way out. He broke the window to simulate a break-in. More locked doors awaited Timothy Massey, who was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Tim Massey tried to disguise his crime through a series of false clues. Other killers spend their time trying to erase any trace evidence at the scene. But it's only a matter of time before the clues they leave behind catch up with them. Pinellas County is a small southern peninsula jutting out of Florida's western flank. It's home to the resort and fishing community of Clearwater. It was also the site of a series of grisly murders. On October 20th, 1995, a delivery person discovered the nude body of a woman outside an industrial park. Police arrived at the scene and began to gather clues. But few were found. The victim's clothing and jewelry were gone, and though marks on her wrists and ankles suggested she'd been tied up at some point, no rope was found. Bruises to her body indicated she'd been beaten, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Lack of footprints and broken vegetation suggested she was killed elsewhere and her body hidden here. The ground did hold a tire impression. Investigators had no guarantee that the killer's vehicle had made it, but the possibility couldn't be overlooked. Plaster was poured over the impression to make a cast for further analysis. At autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Animal hairs were recovered from the body. A few tiny synthetic fibers also were retrieved. None of this would be of any use unless a suspect surfaced. The victim's fingerprints were run through the police database. She was 42-year-old Wendy Ann Evans, who had a record for drugs.
So how long has your mother been missing?
Evans had come to Clearwater to be with her daughter.
When did she?
She's had a bad life.
The victim's daughter told investigators that her mother had been going through some hard times.
I would say approximately.
The victim's father had just died. She'd been trying to kick her drug habit, and she believed her cancer was recurring. A few days before her death, she'd even checked herself into a psychiatric facility to cope with her depression. She wanted desperately to pull her life together. But her luck took a fatal turn for the worse. 3 weeks later, at another industrial area, another nude female body was found.
Call came in. 6210 for ID just arrived. Check this out.
Like Wendy Ann Evans, this victim had been bound and beaten, then left in a secluded spot. Again, there were no signs of sexual assault. The similarities between the two cases defied coincidence. Both were found in industrial areas within 10 miles of each other. The latest victim was identified by police records as 40-year-old Peggy Darnell, a prostitute from Clearwater. Sergeant Mike Ring worked the case.
We had no physical evidence from that scene because of the decomposition of the body. We had no hairs, no fibers, no footprints, no tire tracks that were of any value to the investigation.
Nevertheless, investigators suspected the same person was responsible for both murders. And these might not have been the killer's first victims. A check of police records revealed a third victim. 15 months earlier, a prostitute named LaDonna Steller was found murdered. Except for the span of time, the details were eerily familiar.
All three women were white females. They'd all been found nude, no jewelry or clothing on any of the bodies, and the cause of death, at least on Steller and Evans, was manual strangulation with some physical beating.
The only crime scene to provide potential forensic evidence was the murder of Wendy Ann Evans. Detective Tom Klein of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department tried to make the most of the scant clues.
The tire track had been sent off to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for analysis. The fibers were being analyzed at FDLE. We were consistently talking to the prostitutes in the area and trying to make contact with their Johns. So we were keeping very busy.
And so was the killer. In January 1996, 3 months after Wendy Ann Evans was killed, the body of 27-year-old Cindy Pugh was discovered behind a dumpster. Its location was halfway between where the two other victims were found. And like them, she was nude and had been strangled. If any doubt about a serial killer remained, the murder of Cindy Pugh erased it. The sheets that authorities used to wrap the victims were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab in Tampa Bay. There, they were carefully swept. Anything falling off of them was collected on a crimped sheet of butcher paper called a debris fold. Microanalyst Jerry Serino looked for trace evidence among the debris.
When using a stereo microscope to actually sift through the debris, it's a very time-consuming and slow process.
It was time well spent. Among the debris collected from the Wendy Ann Evans murder, Serino found 4 pink carpet fibers. They matched the carpet fibers found on Cynthia Pugh. More animal hairs were also found. They were sent off for further analysis. Cynthia Pugh's body also had a tiny shred of cigarette filter paper clinging to it. The trace evidence proved that the women were the victims of the same killer, but it brought authorities no closer to finding who that killer was. He was free to keep on killing. Investigators formed a task force to alert potential victims and to monitor the area where the prostitutes worked. Meanwhile, in another department of the FDLE, senior analyst Oral Woods studied the tire tread lifted from the first murder scene.
I was looking for a particular tire with a similar tread design. Once I found that similar tread design in my tire guidebook, I was able then to determine it was a Firestone Radial ATX tire.
A check with the manufacturer revealed that the tire was made for light trucks, but few were sold. In fact, they'd stopped making it 3 years earlier.
We asked them to pull up any inventory that would reflect sales of this particular size and style tire, and they were able to show that there was only one set of 4 tires sold in the Tampa Bay metropolitan area in the previous 3 years.
The manufacturer gave investigators the name of the dealer, who in turn told them who purchased the tires, someone named Terry Howard. Detectives began surveillance at Howard's home and discovered that she was a woman. Someone was killing women in Florida, and investigators' only clue was a tire tread. It brought them to the home of a woman named Terry Jo Howard. She owned a light truck, like the one they were looking for. But it was driven mainly by a man who lived with her.
We didn't have him identified. We had no idea who he was. His name wasn't on any of the leases, wasn't on any of the telephone subscriptions or power subscriptions.
He was put on separate surveillance and was eventually identified as a window installer named James Randall. Investigators' efforts were beginning to pay off.
Once we had Randall identified, we started an in-depth background on him. We found out all about his previous arrests in Massachusetts, the fact that there were outstanding warrants for him for violating his parole, the previous history of him being a suspect in a murder in Massachusetts.
Randall certainly fit the mold for a murder suspect, and the surveillance revealed that the tires on his girlfriend's truck were the same type found at the murder scene. But investigators needed hard evidence. Then they got a break. During the surveillance, Randall pulled into a tire store and had 2 of the truck tires replaced. Police obtained the old ones from the dealer. But it wasn't enough. Their tire expert needed all 4 to make the comparison against the cast from the crime scene. Investigators came up with a plan. First, they purchased a new set of tires to switch with the ones on Randall's truck.
We then had the manager at the tire store contact Terry Jo Howard and told her that the 2 tires that he put on her truck were defective, and if she took the time to bring her truck in, he would give her 4 brand new tires for free. She couldn't come quick enough. She came in, she exchanged the tires, and now we had all 4 tires.
The tire expert determined that one of the tires from Randall's truck was consistent with the impression left at Wendy Ann Evans' murder scene. Not only were the manufacturer's tread patterns the same, but more important, the nicks, abrasions, and wear patterns also matched. Like a fingerprint, these characteristics are unique to every tire. That proved that the truck was there, but it didn't necessarily mean that it was there at the time of the murder. Randall could have driven his truck there days or mere minutes before the crime occurred. Investigators needed proof. They needed physical evidence that directly linked him to the victims. But they still didn't have probable cause to get a search warrant for his house. The stray hairs on both Wendy Ann Evans and Cynthia Pugh's bodies were determined to be dog hair. Randall's girlfriend, Terry Jo Howard, owned a dog. Investigators needed a sample of its fur to make the comparison. But how?
and we came up with the idea of using this female sergeant and one of our other female detectives to pose as mobile dog groomers.
They made up flyers to hand out and post around the neighborhood. They included a phone number and announced they'd be going door to door offering their grooming service. To make the ruse legal, the police had to offer the same service to everyone in the neighborhood. Fortunately, no one else took them up on their offer. They arrived at Terry Joe Howard's home while James Randall was at work. Terry Joe welcomed them in.
We can take her right outside, right out front.
Things went better than expected. There on the floor was a mauve rug, the possible source of the fibers found on the two bodies. The officers washed the pet. They used sterile towels to dry it and collect samples of its fur. The analysis of the dog hairs indicated they matched the ones from the crime scenes. Now, detectives had the tires and the dog hair to tie James Randall to the slayings. But prosecutors felt they still didn't have grounds for a warrant. It was time to pull out their ace in the hole. By living in Florida, Randall was violating his parole in Massachusetts.
That'll do it.
I'll get with you later on.
Okay.
On June 26, 1996, 8 months after the first murder, Pinellas County deputies went to arrest Randall so authorities could keep an eye on him while they built their homicide case. But it wasn't as simple as that. At the sight of the deputies, Randall sped off, racing through a neighborhood before abandoning his truck and fleeing on foot. He managed to scale a fence and vanish into a densely wooded area. Authorities mounted a massive search, but Randall eluded them. They were confident he'd try to make contact with his girlfriend.
Wondering if you had heard anything or seen anything.
I think I had read about.
They went to Terry Joe Howard's house to gauge her knowledge of the crimes. It was the first time they'd contacted her directly. When the police informed her of Randall's criminal record and told her that he was a suspect, she cooperated completely.
Canvassing the area to see if there was anybody
And so
that
did
heard
her
anything
dog.
about the brutal murders that occurred.
One of the things that they noticed was that Terry Joe Howard's dog was always hacking up and spitting. And when he'd hack up and spit, there would be these pieces of paper. And we found out later on that this dog liked to eat cigarette butts out of the ashtray.
Investigators recalled that a tiny piece of cigarette filter paper was collected from the body of Cynthia Pugh. Terry told police that she was the smoker. She consented to give a blood sample so that her DNA could be compared to that found on the crime scene cigarette paper. She also allowed investigators to take her mauve rug to be analyzed. The rug was analyzed and found to contain several kinds of fibers. With the whole rug at his disposal, Jerry Serino was able to get a more complete forensic picture. He compared the rug to fibers taken from victims Pugh and Evans.
I was able to say that those fibers could have come from this particular rug. If they did not come from this particular rug, they came from a rug that had the exact same characteristics that had an opportunity to come in contact with both Cynthia Pugh and Wendy Evans.
In the language of forensic fiber analysis, that's considered the closest thing to an exact match. But it was the DNA analysis that clinched the case. It linked the scrap of paper found on Cynthia Pugh to the cigarettes in the home of Terry Joe Howard and the suspect, James Randall. Randall, still on the lam, returned to the house 4 days after he fled. But when he saw detectives there, he took off again. This time, he didn't get away. Investigators believe that while Terry Joe Howard was out of town, he'd pick up prostitutes, bring them home, and kill them. But Randall was careful. Except for the scrap of cigarette paper, he left no DNA on his victims. He didn't need to. In April 1997, based on the forensic evidence, James Randall was convicted of second-degree murder for the killing of Wendy Ann Evans and Cynthia Pugh. He was given 2 life sentences. Some killers choose a remote venue. Others doctor the site to conceal their presence. And some take great pains to leave no trace of themselves behind. In the end, it doesn't matter. If the killer has been there, forensics can find something they've left at the scene. Police investigating the disappearance of a woman in Iowa close in on a suspect. But to prove murder, they must identify a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. In Ohio, a grave is unearthed at a construction site. A makeshift coffin and human bones are all investigators have to lead them to a killer. An Illinois state trooper makes a gruesome discovery on the side of the road. Investigators must make their case from the unknown victim's teeth. Some killers believe that they have left no trace of themselves or their victims behind. But forensic scientists have found ways to decipher a killer's calling card by reading clues written in bone. Located on a bend on the Mississippi River, Davenport, Iowa is known as a quiet fishing community. But on March 18, 1983, police were visited by a concerned citizen named Marianne Roth. Marianne was worried about her friend Joyce Clint. They had spoken on the phone earlier in the morning and had made plans to spend the afternoon together. But Joyce hadn't shown up. Joyce had been under a lot of stress in recent weeks. Her marriage was in bad shape, and she and her husband, Jim, were considering divorce.
I don't think so.
Marianne described Joyce as a dedicated mother, not the type to simply run off without a word. For the sake of their son, Bart, Joyce had tried to keep the marriage together. But she wasn't naive. Marianne turned over a tape that Joyce had made several days before her disappearance.
2 days ago.
Joyce had planned to use it as evidence if the divorce went to trial. When investigators played the tape, they quickly realized that Joyce had secretly recorded an incriminating conversation between her and Jim. On it, she confronted her husband about money he was allegedly skimming from his chiropractic business. Responding to the threats, Jim told Joyce that if she exposed him, he would put her head under the pillow, smother her, and then cut her up into little pieces.
You're not going to touch that money. Do you understand?
Though it was savage talk, police are used to hearing these kinds of violent threats from couples facing divorce. To investigators, it was more likely that Joyce had decided to leave town.
Just a family quarrel.
With the tape safe at Marianne's, she could slip away until the divorce case went to trial. That theory was supported the following day. Joyce's friends discovered her car parked near the airport. Inside the vehicle, police found no evidence of a struggle or any signs of foul play. For investigators, everything suggested that Joyce had gone missing on purpose. Corporal Jerry McCabe of the Davenport Police Department worked the investigation.
It first looked like a possible family argument where she may have taken off and hadn't spoken to anybody in a while.
But the persistence of Joyce Clint's friends convinced police to look into the disappearance. They paid a visit to Jim Clint. Jim readily admitted that he and Joyce had fought on the morning of the 18th. He had stormed out and gone to the marina where he kept his boat in order to cool off. Because of rising floodwaters, he decided not to go out on the river. He secured his boat and returned home. By that time, he said Joyce was gone, along with a closet full of clothes and $4,000 of his money. Investigators checked on his alibi with a visit to the marina.
Did you see him on March 18th?
A restaurant manager confirmed that she saw Clint that morning, around 11 a.m. She saw Clint loading filled trash bags onto his boat. She said he left the dock in his boat, returned sometime later, and then went out again. This eyewitness account contradicted Jim's alibi. Detectives decided to take a closer look into Jim Clint's background. Jim Clint's drinking and philandering were well known in the small community of Davenport. Police learned that he had been having a blatant affair with one of his patients. Hoping to learn more, investigators tracked the woman down. She told investigators that on the day of Joyce's disappearance, Jim had invited her over around noon. He had a surprise. He said that Joyce agreed to a divorce and had left town. Now they could finally be together. Joyce's threats to expose Jim's alleged embezzling, coupled with the information about his extramarital affair, gave investigators reason to believe that Jim Clint had motive to kill his wife. But without any hard evidence that a crime had been committed, it was still just speculation. But on April 15th, nearly a month after Joyce's disappearance, the Mississippi River would offer a gruesome clue. Several miles south of Davenport, two fishermen noticed something floating in the river. As they got closer, they could see that it was the remains of something human. They fled the scene and called 911. Investigators responded to the riverbank and pulled the body from the water. It was a female torso, severed just above the navel and just below the tops of the thighs. For even the most seasoned detectives, the scene was difficult to comprehend. A limited autopsy determined that the victim was a Caucasian woman who'd been in the water anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 months. The cut marks appeared to have been made by a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain. Mindful of the violent threats Jim had made on the tape, investigators believed they had found Joyce Clint. But they were a long way from proving murder. To make their case, they would first have to identify the remains. and that wouldn't be easy. Investigators turned to renowned forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow at the University of Oklahoma. His approach is simple.
And basically what we try to do is look at the skeleton, all 200 bones and 32 teeth, and we're trying to answer two questions primarily. Who is this person? Who was this person? And how did they die?
Snow's expertise allows him to develop a profile from the barest of bones. Even with only the torso to work with, Snow could tell a lot about the victim. To determine her age, he studied the area of the pelvis known as the pubic symphysis.
The surfaces of this joint undergo some fairly regular changes with age. In younger people, there's a system of strong grooves, you might say, and ridges. They gradually begin to disappear in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, so on, till finally you wind up with a rather flat, featureless surface.
Based on the ridge detail in the victim's pelvis, Snow believed the victim was between 26 and 34 years old. Next, he studied the dimensions of the remaining leg and hip bones and calculated that she was between 5 feet and 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed between 125 and 140 pounds. Even though Joyce Clint fit those measurements, police soon learned that so did dozens of other missing women. Until investigators could narrow down their pool of possible victims, the identity of the severed torso would remain a mystery. Police in Davenport, Iowa struggled with two cases: the disappearance of Joyce Clint and the discovery of a severed torso pulled from the Mississippi River. They believed the cases were connected, and they believed Joyce's husband, Jim, was responsible. But until they could positively identify the remains, they couldn't prove murder. Using the description of the victim supplied by forensic anthropologist Dr. Clyde Snow, Davenport Police Lieutenant Dennis Kern began a computerized search of all missing women in the region. The computer returned the names of 17 missing women. Detectives were able to eliminate 8 of the women since they had disappeared after the torso was found. 2 of the women were ultimately found, and another 3 didn't match the physical description.
When we were finished with 4 people, one of whom was Joyce Clint.
With the investigation taking on a more narrow focus, investigators decided to pay another visit to Jim Clint. They returned to his home, this time with a search warrant. In his garage, they found what they were looking for: a chainsaw with a 5/16 of an inch chain, the same width as the cut marks on the body. Technicians processed the chainsaw with indicator fluid that turns pink in the presence of blood. They covered every square inch of the saw. Not a single drop of blood or tissue could be found. Either Jim Clint was smarter than investigators had imagined, or the torso found in the river was not Joyce Clint. There was only one way to be sure. Police had to find a way to positively identify the remains. Though DNA analysis hadn't yet been developed in 1983, there were new ways of identifying an individual from genetic markers in blood enzymes. Blood samples were subpoenaed from Jim Clint and his son Bart. A comparison with the blood from the victim showed a genetic consistency with Bart. Further tests of Joyce Clint's parents' blood also showed consistent patterns. The genetic information on its own was not enough to establish identity. But out of the 4 unaccounted for women, only Joyce Clint matched both the physical description as described by Dr. Snow and the genetic description provided by the blood tests. The conclusion was unmistakable.
Looking at the women that met these physical characteristics, what of those 4, what were the odds that any one of them would have matched the genetic picture? And the odds were infinitesimal.
The torso belonged to Joyce Clint. And all of the evidence pointed to her husband Jim as the killer.
There was a division of monies, properties, and that he was going to lose. He was going to have a lot of things taken away from him because she was done, fed up, ready to go. And the girlfriend motive was there. There were so many that he thought that were in his way of a happier life, you know.
Jim was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. Police believe that Jim executed his plan on the morning of March 18th. After murdering Joyce in their home, he drove her remains to a remote spot where he dismembered her with a chainsaw. He used his boat to dispose of the body parts and the saw. He then placed her car near the airport to throw investigators off his trail. Though he maintained his innocence through the trial, the jury found Jim Clint guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Jim Clint thought that dismemberment would keep himself and his victim from ever being identified. In Ohio, a killer tried to avoid prosecution by keeping his horrible secret buried deep in the ground. On June 20th, 1990, in the small northern Ohio town of Elyria, a construction worker uncovered a long-buried secret. His bulldozer struck a hard object, resting several feet beneath the ground. It appeared to be a wooden box. As he walked closer to the find, he was overwhelmed by a horrible odor. He realized he had unearthed a makeshift grave. He called police. Lieutenant Dan Jekyll of the Elyria Police Department was immediately dispatched to the site. Due to the construction, the scene had already been compromised.
But we were concerned about the evidence. The evidence was being pushed down by the bulldozer. There were bits of pieces and wood that might have been carried 25, 30, 40 yards away, besides the initial scene that we had to protect.
That wasn't their only problem. Rain clouds threatened to destroy possible trace evidence. With the site now exposed, they would only have this one chance to get what they needed. To preserve any potential findings, investigators had to treat the scene like an archaeological dig, sifting through the earth for stray bullets, jewelry, or other identification with deliberate precision. The initial search of the construction site turned up no clues to tell investigators the identity of the victim. After several hours, the badly decomposed body, wrapped in garbage bags, was hand dug from the grave. Despite their continued efforts, no additional evidence or identification was found. Police needed to know who was in the grave before they could figure out how he or she got there. For help, investigators called on distinguished anthropology professor Dr. Owen Lovejoy at Kent State University.
I went out and examined the body and collected some materials, the purpose of which was to provide as many details about that individual in life as I could.
From the condition of the pelvis, examiners were able to determine that the body was a female, somewhere around 28 to 30 years old. An examination into the shape and proportions of the skull told them that the victim was Caucasian. Dr. Lovejoy measured the thigh and arm bones and factored them into an equation to determine the victim's height. She was surprisingly tall, almost 6 feet. Dr. Lovejoy had provided investigators with their first glimpse of how the victim appeared alive. It was now up to them to discover her identity. Detectives started by looking into unsolved missing persons cases. But in all of those cases, none of the missing women fit the description of the buried body. Investigators turned their attention to the only other piece of evidence. Though it seemed like a long shot, they called in a draftsman to measure the fractured pieces of the makeshift coffin and render a detailed illustration of it. Investigators turned the illustration over to the local paper, along with the description of the unidentified woman. Days later, a woman called to say that she thought she recognized the makeshift coffin. The woman remembered admiring the piece in her friend Sandra Stuller's apartment.
Again, we talked on the phone.
She told police it had been over 3 years since Sandra disappeared without a goodbye. She wasn't able to offer any speculation on what happened to her old friend, but she was able to give police a valuable piece of information. Like the woman found at the construction site, Sandra Stuller was 6 feet tall. Though still unsure that they'd identified their victim, it was the investigators' only lead. Detectives tracked down an aunt and uncle of Sandra's living in the area. Like the witness who identified the chest, they hadn't seen their niece in the past 3 years. The relatives said that shortly before they lost touch, Sandra had rekindled a relationship with her ex-husband, Doug Hartman.
Great.
He had been a loving and supportive husband at first, but as the years went by, he grew abusive. Sandra eventually left him, but Doug wanted her back, and against the wishes of her relatives, she decided to give him another chance.
And the family told Sandra, this is a bad move. You should not go back to Douglas Hartman. In fact, if you decide to do that, you're no longer part of this family.
But Sandra stuck with Doug, and the family severed ties.
Well, I appreciate it. If you hear from her...
They hadn't heard from her since. Now, investigators needed to pick up the story where the aunt and uncle's account left off.
I
They tracked down the manager of Sandra's last known apartment, where she lived just before she disappeared in 1987.
She had paid rent in full. But
Apparently, the reunion with Doug had been short-lived. Sandra had been living alone at the time.
and she wasn't there.
The manager remembered that the circumstances surrounding Sandra's departure were strange. In December of 1987, she saw a man moving Sandra's belongings out of the apartment and into a rental truck. The manager had not seen the man before. She didn't see Sandra that day or ever again. Sandra had abandoned her apartment without a word. Investigators suspected the man moving Sandra's things was Doug Hartman. To prove that theory, they went to the truck rental agency. They pored over hundreds of receipts from 3 years before.
That's it.
On one of the receipts from December of 1987, they found what they came for.
Do you happen to remember anything about this gentleman?
The name of Sandra's ex-husband, Doug Hartman.
Okay. I appreciate it.
It was time to question Doug, but there was no record of him living in town. But detectives managed to find a relative still in the area. He told police he hadn't heard from Doug since he had gone to live with his grandmother in Fredericksburg, Virginia, a few years back. Detectives wondered what had prompted Doug to leave town.
And if you hear from him or think of anything else.
But their theories would be meaningless until they could prove that the buried remains belonged to Sandra Stuller. Detectives in Elyria, Ohio, believed that the body and the makeshift coffin unearthed at a construction site belonged to Sandra Stuller. And they suspected that her ex-husband, Doug Hartman, had put her there. Word of the investigation into Sandra Stuller's whereabouts spread quickly. A local bank manager contacted detectives. He too had been searching for Sandra. She had stopped paying rent on a security deposit box. Investigators obtained a search warrant. The contents of the box included Sandra's divorce decree, her will, and some diamond and gold jewelry. Not the kind of valuable items a person would carelessly abandon, unless, as Detective Dan Jekyll thought, they had no choice.
And that reinforced my idea that the person that we uncovered on Shadden Road was in fact Sandra Stuller, but I had to prove it.
Detectives were running out of ways to accomplish that goal. Desperate for any information, they plugged Sandra's Social Security number into a law enforcement database. They got a hit. Sandra had been in a car accident shortly before she disappeared. The report mentioned that she had been taken to the hospital for treatment, which included X-rays. It was the break detectives were looking for.
When I found out that there was a chest X-ray taken, I knew that this would help the case. And when I contacted Dr. Lovejoy, he told me if I can get that original X-ray, there's a real good chance that he could identify the remains.
Investigators visited the hospital and subpoenaed Sandra Stuller's X-rays. Now that they had a source of comparison, they turned back to the expertise of forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Lovejoy.
Initially, when we looked at her skeleton and compared it to these chest films, we realized that there were a number of very special characters that were very rare. One of these was the fact that she only had 11 ribs, when a normal individual usually has 12. That's a fairly rare abnormality. Another is that the individual had suffered a fracture of her right clavicle. And so these were two characters that matched both the bones that we had.
It was powerful evidence, but not conclusive. Lovejoy next had to examine the very fine details preserved inside the bone. There, small features called trabecula are as unique as the characteristics of a fingerprint. To make the comparison, Dr. Lovejoy began by re-X-raying the bones with a powerful machine called a faxitron that produces high-resolution images of bone. That completed, he then compared the trabecula one by one.
We did this in this particular case and found that they were in fact an exact match, so that there was no question that these were the remains of Sandra Stuller.
The victim had finally been identified. Investigators now needed to establish and prove motive in her death. Looking through her financial records, they believed they found their answer. Prior to her disappearance, Sandra had inherited over $100,000 when her mother died. She had set up a $50,000 mutual fund and had been living off the interest. But a letter in the file, signed by Sandra after she had already been murdered, requested that her assets be transferred to an account in Fredericksburg, Virginia. That account was in the name of Doug Hartman. Sandra Stuller had been murdered for her money.
And through bank records and subpoenas, I was able to track that $51,000 into Douglas Hartman's own personal checking account. I did have a motive then.
Doug was brought back to Ohio for questioning. When investigators confronted him with all of the evidence, he began to crumble. He confessed to killing her, but claimed that it had been an accident. Police believed otherwise. After murdering Sandra and burying her body, Doug fled to Virginia, where he had all of her assets transferred into his bank account. It took a jury less than 6 hours to find Doug Hartman guilty of aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and theft. He was sentenced to life in prison. Though Sandra Stuller's body had been buried for more than 3 years, investigators were able to solve her murder from the bare bones. In Illinois, investigators had even less to work with. Stretching from Chicago to Springfield, I-55 is one of the most heavily traveled highways in Illinois. State troopers regularly cruise its length, hunting down speeders. But on March 10th, 1986, it was not a speeder that caught the troopers' attention. Something was burning on the side of the road. As the officer approached, he thought it was a mannequin that had been set on fire. But as he got closer, he realized it was something far more disturbing. It was the charred mass of a human body. After extinguishing the blaze, the trooper called for backup. The following morning, evidence technicians from the Illinois Division of Criminal Investigations began processing the area for clues. The scene offered little indication as to who could have committed this brutal act. The only potential evidence was a set of tire tracks imprinted in the soil. But on a well-traveled highway, they could have belonged to anyone. Technicians made a plaster mold of the tread marks in the hopes a suspect would emerge and could then be placed at the scene. But finding a suspect would be difficult, if not impossible, until detectives could identify the remains. At autopsy, the examiner concluded the female victim had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The only identifying features that survived the fire were her teeth. A pearl necklace and a ring bearing the letter E were removed from the victim. Based on her petite stature and slender hip dimensions, the examiner believed the victim to be between 18 and 25 years old, and possibly Hispanic. For Lieutenant Carlos Hevia of the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations, the information wasn't a lot to go on.
The first order of business is identify who's the victim. In this particular case, we had difficulty because of the fact that we didn't have a photograph to go around when we were doing canvassing.
Nonetheless, investigators began questioning people in the neighborhoods around the scene of the fire. One clerk at a nearby gas station remembered selling a can of gasoline the night before. He helped investigators come up with a composite. The sketch was publicized, but no one came forward to name the suspect. Investigators launched a statewide media campaign. A flood of tips came in, but after 2 weeks, detectives still couldn't match the remains to any missing persons cases. With their whole case hinging on identification, investigators sought help from the state's forensic anthropology department. After taking a life-sized X-ray of the victim's skull, they built a three-dimensional model, sculpting a face in modeling clay. It might not be an identical match, but hopefully it would bring about a spark of recognition from the public. Photographs of the reconstructed head and the victim's ring were sent to local press. But again, no one came forward to identify the young woman. Now, several weeks after the murder, chances of solving the case were dwindling away. A methodical killer still walked the streets. After several weeks, investigators were no closer to solving the brutal murder of an unidentified woman whose body had been set on fire and left burning on the side of an Illinois highway. Desperate to identify the remains, investigators sent the victim's skull and teeth to Dr. Stephen Smith, a consultant in forensic dentistry.
In the worst of circumstances, the teeth pretty well survive. And so because of that, we become very useful for the uniqueness of the human dentition. We can find the uniquenesses that everybody has in their dentition. And that's enough to separate us from one human being to another.
The arch of the jaw suggested that the victim was most likely Asian, not Hispanic. After studying the general anatomy, Dr. Smith examined each individual tooth.
This would be the temporary cement that would indicate that this person is probably going to be going back to the dentist. And I see some bone loss in this area, This would indicate periodontal disease, and that the person probably was possibly seeing a periodontist.
This kind of dental history gave Dr. Smith new insight into the victim's age.
As I looked at this information and as I came to my independent evaluation, I thought this person had to be at least in their 40s. 38 to 40, maybe 42, 43, somewhere like that, but not more than a 5-year difference.
Dr. Smith's detailed analysis had exposed a critical flaw in the original description of the victim. She couldn't have been between the ages of 18 and 25 as previously thought. He showed that she was some 20 years older than that.
In this particular case, we were scrambling because we were chasing an 18 to 25-year-old missing person that was not our victim. So when they came up with that, it was like somebody just opened a door, you know.
Now, almost 2 months after the burning body had been found, detectives went back to the statewide police computer network and modified the victim's description. The new findings paid off. Within hours of modifying their search, investigators received a call from nearby DuPage County Sheriff's Department. They had a missing persons case that matched the new description. Illinois State Police met with DuPage County Sheriffs to discuss the case. They learned Erlinda Anderson was a 43-year-old housewife reported missing by her sister in early March. Born in the Philippines, she'd come to the United States to marry her husband, William. The fact that this victim's name began with the letter E led investigators to believe they were on the right track.
All right, thanks very much.
Deputies told investigators that they had met with William Anderson shortly after his wife was reported missing. He was questioned about his wife and their marriage. It hadn't been a traditional courtship. During the interview, Anderson admitted that he'd met Erlinda through a classified ad. She was looking for an American husband. He was looking for companionship. The relationship started well, Anderson said. She seemed very happy with the comforts of middle-class America. But as the marriage wore on, Erlinda became very homesick. He insisted Erlinda wasn't missing. In fact, he'd seen her board a plane bound for the Philippines in early March. Following up on William Anderson's story, DuPage County investigators questioned Erlinda's friends. They confirmed that Erlinda had been unhappy with her life in the U.S., mostly because of her marriage to William. And she had been longing to return home. But it was strange that they hadn't heard from their friend in months. William Anderson's inconsistent story, coupled with Dr. Smith's forensic analysis, led investigators to now believe the victim found burning on the side of the road was Erlinda Anderson. And that would make her husband the leading suspect in her murder. But so far, there was no evidence to prove it. Investigators from the Illinois Department of Criminal Investigations were getting closer to identifying charred remains found along a highway. They believed the victim was 43-year-old Erlinda Anderson. But until they could be sure, police wouldn't be able to make a case against the prime suspect, her husband, William. With only the victim's teeth to work with, investigators subpoenaed Erlinda's dental records.
Right.
They were sent to forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith for comparison. While awaiting the results of his examination, detectives began scrutinizing William Anderson's alibi. He had claimed that he had seen Erlinda board a plane bound for the Philippines. Investigators paid a visit to the airlines.
I'm looking at...
Anderson had in fact purchased a ticket to Manila in Erlinda's name. But a week before her body was found, records showed that William Anderson cashed in the ticket. Erlinda never boarded a plane to the Philippines. William Anderson had been caught in a blatant lie. But if Anderson had killed his wife, the question now before investigators was why? A further background check revealed that Erlinda had been William's 5th wife. Based on a search of Anderson's phone records, they learned that he probably didn't intend her to be his last. Many of the bills reflected calls to one of Anderson's female co-workers. The woman, who was married, reluctantly admitted that she and Anderson had been having an affair. Anderson complained to her that Erlinda was constantly spending his money, always sending gifts to her friends and family in the Philippines. The day after the body was found, William took her out for a romantic dinner. He told her to leave her husband and marry him instead.
She questioned Anderson about, well, you know, what about your wife? And Anderson told her, don't worry about my wife, she's not coming back.
The case was now in the hands of forensic dentist Dr. Stephen Smith. When making an identification, Smith superimposes the living dental records with the x-rays made after death.
On this case here, I can take and move it around, and all of a sudden I see a clear picture. It was fuzzy, now it's totally clear. It means that the one film overlays the other one perfectly. In myself, if I'm asked, is this a match, I could say yes. I would be assured, looking at this film, that this film matches that film, and I could say that this dentition belongs to that remains.
After months of frustration, the burned body had finally been identified as Erlinda Anderson. And with a new romance brewing, William Anderson had motive to get rid of her. Still lacking physical evidence linking him to the murder, investigators paid him another visit. They asked him to follow them to the police station for further questioning. While police began their interrogation, a warrant was obtained to search Anderson's car. Though the tire treads did not match those found at the crime scene, the trunk and the items inside it were splattered with red stains. Indicator tests confirmed the presence of human blood on a windbreaker and a tire iron. The blood was too deteriorated to make a detailed comparison, but it was one more piece of incriminating evidence. The results of the examination were brought up to police. William Anderson was placed under arrest. Investigators believe that Anderson used the tire iron to beat Erlinda in the head. After she was dead, he drove her body down Interstate 55. He doused her body in gasoline, thinking that all his problems would burn away in the ensuing fire. Without the insights of forensic dentistry, he might have gotten away without a trace. A jury found William Anderson guilty of murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Some killers are determined to keep the identity of their victims a secret. When they are successful, their deeds threaten to go unpunished. But forensic scientists can breathe life into a dying investigation and find justice written in bone. A young mother is found murdered near her Indiana home. Investigators have only one piece of evidence to help them find her killer. When a female body is discovered along the banks of an Alabama river, detectives must rely on a few tiny shreds of evidence to make their case. In New York, a woman is found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs. Police must determine if her death is a suicide or murder. When there are no eyewitnesses to a murder, investigators look to the physical evidence to make their case. Forensic examiners seek out that one clue that can break a case wide open, a clue known as the silent witness. Named for the river flowing through its center, Elkhart, Indiana epitomizes the ideal of small-town America. It's a quiet, close-knit community, a place unfamiliar with the problems of violent crime. On March 3, 1992, a concerned father entered the Elkhart Police Department to file a missing persons report. Ruben Hernandez hadn't heard from his daughter in nearly 15 hours. 25-year-old Sandra Hernandez had dropped off her 3-year-old son around 5 p.m. the previous evening. Ruben believed that Sandra had a date that night. After saying her goodbyes, Sandra promised she would be back in a couple of hours to pick him up.
Okay.
Ruben and his wife were always happy to spend time with their only grandson, and they were glad to see that Sandra was starting to enjoy her life again. She had recently ended a turbulent 4-year relationship with her child's possessive father. Ruben explained that when he went to check on Sandra at her apartment, he got no response, though her car was still parked out front.
One particular guy that's been giving her a hard time.
Mr. Hernandez's concerns prompted Elkhart Police Lieutenant Tom Cutler to forego the 24-hour waiting period required before opening a missing persons investigation.
He's a fellow who was very concerned about not only his grandchild who he was taking care of, but also his missing daughter. And he knew that she wouldn't take off and leave the child without touching base with him.
After distributing Sandra's description to area law enforcement agencies, police quickly contacted her ex-boyfriend.
Did you guys argue?
Sean Parks strongly denied any knowledge of Sandra's disappearance.
Stuff about the kid, you know.
Why did you bring up something really like
But he admitted that his 4-year relationship with her had been rocky. He said that recently he and Sandra had been arguing frequently, and sometimes violently. Mostly, they fought over custody of their son. Sandra vowed she would never give up her child.
What did you guys talk
But
about?
despite the tensions, Parks insisted he would never hurt Sandra or their son.
Confrontation with Sandra. What were you doing Sunday night?
On the night Sandra disappeared, he claimed he was at work.
Okay, with some friends, okay.
Though Parks was cooperative, investigators know from experience that custody battles can sometimes end in murder.
We checked with work and he was there all night and didn't leave the premise. So we had no reason to believe that he had interacted with Sandra Hernandez on that night.
With the only obvious suspect eliminated, investigators had to consider that Sandra might have left town on her own volition. And though that seemed unlikely, they had to be certain. They went to her residence to search for answers. What they found only supported their suspicions that the young mother had met with foul play. None of Sandra's clothes seemed to be missing, and her luggage was still neatly stored in her closet.
Hey, Jim.
In the kitchen, detectives found a container filled with $230 in cash.
Driver's license.
Sandra's driver's license was also in the tin, with several other personal papers. Police saw no evidence to suggest that she had simply packed up and left town.
I don't think she was going anywhere.
Her neighbors later stated that they had not seen or heard Sandra at her apartment since she left to drop off her son the night she disappeared. With each passing hour, investigators realized that the chances of finding Sandra unharmed grew slimmer. They needed to determine if Sandra had in fact been on a date the night she disappeared, and if so, with whom. Sandra's friend, who worked with her at a door manufacturing company, came in to answer questions. She hadn't noticed anything unusual about Sandra's demeanor in recent days.
How long has he been with the company?
In fact, the night she disappeared, Sandra was excited about a date she was going on with a coworker.
Pushing the issue for quite a while.
The man, Ricky Joyner, was a delivery driver at the company.
Right.
And had been friends with Sandra for some time. When contacted by police, Joyner volunteered to come answer questions. Investigators immediately noticed fresh scratches on his face and hands. Joyner claimed a door falling on him at work caused the injuries. He admitted that he had been out with Sandra the night she disappeared, but only as friends. He said he picked her up at 6 p.m. They had dinner and then went to a movie that lasted about 2 hours.
Are you ready to drive? Do I lie?
He dropped her off around 9:30. Sandra was in a hurry to pick up her son. He watched her get into her car and leave. He hadn't seen or heard from Sandra since.
Thank you.
Bye.
Investigators asked Joyner to fill out a scientific content analysis form, referred to as a SCAN questionnaire. Like a polygraph, the questionnaire allows investigators to analyze a person's written responses for signs of deception or inconsistencies.
The SCAN questionnaire is a written form that we give people that ask people pointed questions and ask them to respond in their own writing. So it gives us a way to do an informal interview that sometimes reveals a lot about the information that the person's given.
Investigators analyzed Joyner's statements. Using the information to reconstruct Sandra's movements prior to her disappearance, Lieutenant Cutler quickly found a troubling inconsistency.
Part of his statement was that he had let her off at the apartment and she'd gotten into her car and left. Well, her car was still there, and the neighbors said no, nobody came there that night. So that leads us to believe that that part of the story was not true.
Though police had no motive and no direct evidence that a crime had been committed, they obtained a warrant to search Joyner's residence. But the search turned up nothing. Investigators knew they needed to look past the obvious. They collected ordinary household items, including a trash bag from Joyner's kitchen dotted with stains that appeared to be blood. Tests later showed, however, that the substance was not of human origin. Having found no hard evidence linking Joyner to Sandra's disappearance, the investigation threatened to go cold.
Canvases of where she lived. Well, certainly they're looking grim. Unfortunately, we still don't know how to assess them. We suspect that some foul plays happened. We've seen cases where people take off and vanish for reasons that nobody knows about, and they come back. We were certainly concerned that this was not a good situation and that we were going to find her dead.
On April 15, 1992, a month and a half after Sandra Hernandez was reported missing, their worst fears were confirmed. A farmer in nearby LaGrange County, Indiana, made a gruesome discovery: the body of a young woman.
1023 the location. Okay, Claire, we're just a couple minutes away.
As investigators in Elkhart, Indiana continued searching for 25-year-old Sandra Hernandez, they received a call from police in nearby LaGrange County. A body matching Sandra's description had been found in an isolated field. A black trash bag covering the victim's head was removed and preserved as evidence. Using photographs, investigators confirmed that Sandra Hernandez had finally been found. Police began scouring the scene for any useful evidence, but nothing that could help them identify a suspect was found. After an exhaustive search of the area, it appeared that Sandra's killer had been careful not to leave any trace of evidence behind. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Sandra had died of asphyxiation resulting from manual strangulation. An analysis of the victim's stomach contents indicated that she had been murdered within an hour after eating. The medical examiner's analysis made Ricky Joyner's alibi impossible. Sandra could not have gone to a 2-hour movie after eating dinner with Joyner, as he had previously claimed.
Has anybody been in their house yet?
But to prove murder, investigators knew they needed more than a few inconsistencies in Joyner's story. They had to come up with hard evidence to tie Joyner to the crime scene. But all they had was the trash bag recovered from Joyner's apartment.
The trash bag turns out to have the most significance of anything that's taken. The trash bag that's found on the corpse, when the state police tech decide to look at the evidence, send it to the lab, they talk to our techs, and they decide, hey, we've got this bag from Joyner, the suspect's apartment. Let's send it to the lab with the bag we found on the corpse just to have them look at it.
The bags were sent to forensic examiner John Vanderkolk at the Indiana State Police Crime Lab. Though it seemed like a long shot, Vanderkolk was asked to determine if the bag recovered from the victim and the bag seized from Joyner's apartment could have come from the same piece of plastic. To begin his analysis, Vanderkolk began by looking for repeatable class characteristics.
The repeatable class characteristics would be the cutting tool that would use to cut the bags apart, the size and shape of the bag, the general color of the bag, the dimensions of the bag, and any feature of the bag that can be repeated by the manufacturing process.
By shining a light through the evidence, Vanderkolk determined that random color variations, microscopic impurities, and stretch marks were consistent between the bags. He continued his analysis by comparing the bags end to end. Vanderkolk found that the unique tool marks made as the bags were separated during manufacturing corresponded between the top of one of the bags and the bottom of the other. He was certain that the two bags had originated from the same piece of plastic, and in fact, they had come from the same roll.
I was convinced by the random pigment variation that carried over from one bag to the other, and also the random impurities and the stretch marks generated off the impurities that carried over from one bag to the other directly across the cut separation. The randomness definitely carried over throughout the circumference of the bottom of the bag from Sandra Hernandez's head and the top of the bag that Elkhart Police Department had recovered from Ricky Joyner's house.
With no way to explain how a trash bag from his apartment ended up around the victim's head, Ricky Joyner was arrested and charged with the murder of Sandra Hernandez. Police surmised that after going out to dinner together, Sandra went with Joyner to his residence. But something went wrong. After a violent struggle, Joyner strangled Sandra to death. Police theorized that before putting her body into his car, he covered Sandra's head with a trash bag to keep traces of blood from being left behind. He then drove his victim to nearby LaGrange County. He placed her in the isolated field and left her there. After extensive legal proceedings, a jury found Ricky Joyner guilty of the murder of Sandra Hernandez. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Ricky Joyner believed that an ordinary trash bag would cover up his crime. Other killers will go to even greater lengths to conceal their guilt. Nestled in the Tennessee River Valley, the city of Decatur, Alabama clings to a rich and colorful past. Its laid-back southern charm and its reputation as a fishing haven attract thousands of sportsmen each year. But in 1988, the river attracted a different kind of visitor. On July 5th, a fisherman called Decatur police after stumbling upon a body dressed in a nightgown and a blue pajama top near the shoreline. Police could determine that the body was female, but little else. The victim had been decapitated. After securing the area, investigators began the task of processing the scene for clues that could tell them who this victim was. They knew that because she had been decapitated, her identity would be the key to exposing this killer. The crime scene had little to offer. Blood-spattered rocks on the path and drag marks in the overgrowth led detectives to conclude that the victim had been killed elsewhere and then brought to the river. There were no signs of tire tracks or anything else that could help police identify the killer. With only the victim's fingerprints to work with, Sergeant John Boyd of the Decatur Police Department began trying to put a name to the Jane Doe.
And from those fingerprints, we tried a number of agencies to see if we could make an identification. We tried through here, we tried through Huntsville, and we couldn't get anything.
To expand the search, the prints were cataloged and then forwarded to the FBI, whose national fingerprint database might yield better results. In the meantime, investigators hoped an autopsy could tell them more about how this victim died. Determining the exact cause of death would be difficult. But the medical examiner did find a few faint ligature marks below where the head had been severed, indicating that the victim had been strangled before being decapitated with a dull cutting tool. The pajama top and nightgown worn by the victim were collected and forwarded to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. There, trace evidence examiner John Kilbourne began processing the clothes for any potential clues.
We use a method that we call taping, where we take cellophane tape and using the sticky or adhesive surface of the tape, we press it down on the clothing, and what this does is collect any particles, hairs, fibers, or other particles from the surface of that clothing.
Kilbourne found a substantial number of hairs and assorted red and black synthetic fibers that had clung to the victim's clothing. Having more than 20 years' experience analyzing similar evidence from crime scenes, Kilbourne believed he knew their origin.
Some of the fibers were unusual in that the fibers had adhesive on them, some type of glue on the surface. I have had other cases similar that had fibers similar to this, and in each of these cases it turned out to be adhesive from a felt car mat in the trunk mat. And I felt like in looking at these fibers, we're looking at possibly this victim having been in the trunk of a car.
But until examiners had a source of comparison, the value of these items on their own would remain limited. 3 days later, police believed they got their first break. Fishermen had reported finding a human head floating near the shoreline. The area was less than a mile from where Jane Doe's body had been discovered.
It had been decaying, obviously, at least 3 days. It was an overwhelming stench. The head was in a severe state of decomposition. We had extreme difficulty in even picking it up to get it inside the boat. We finally had to get enough plastic bags and bag it up and put it on ice, and put it in a styrofoam cooler and put it on ice and carried it down to the forensic lab.
But prolonged exposure to the elements made it impossible for examiners to find any identifiable features. Frustrated by the lack of progress, police realized that until they could find a way to identify the decapitated woman, this case would likely remain unsolved. Police in Decatur, Alabama were making little progress in identifying a headless female victim pulled from the banks of the Tennessee River. Over the next 10 days, investigators scoured through dozens of missing persons reports in an effort to learn the victim's identity. But none matched the description of their Jane Doe. The case threatened to go unsolved. But on July 15th, they got a break. Searching through military files, the FBI found a fingerprint match with the victim.
A couple questions. I can be over just a...
Jane Doe was identified as 32-year-old Sandra Gale Leslie, formerly enlisted in the United States Air Force. Records indicated that she currently lived in Nashville, Tennessee, 120 miles away from where she was found. Police jumped on the lead.
On that same day, after we learned who she was, we contacted Nashville Metro authorities and found out that they did in fact have a missing person report on Mrs. Leslie.
Police learned that Sandra Leslie had been reported missing by her husband 2 days after her body was discovered in Alabama. Decatur police traveled to Tennessee and teamed up with Nashville authorities.
Referring to female friend, male friend?
Their first visit was to Sandra Leslie's husband. 39-year-old Billy Leslie told police that his marriage to Sandra had been shaky. But he loved his wife of almost 10 years and said they were trying to work out their problems. A few days before her disappearance, the couple dropped off their 2 kids with relatives in an effort to spend more time alone together. But on the afternoon of July 4th, Billy returned home from running errands to find that Sandra and her clothes were gone.
Hello? Hey, how you doing?
He said that in the weeks before her disappearance, Sandra had received numerous unexplained phone calls.
Bye-bye.
Afterward, she would often leave the house with no explanation, leaving Billy to take care of the kids. He was convinced she was having an affair, though he didn't know with whom. As a matter of routine, police asked if they could look around. Billy gave his consent. To their surprise, investigators immediately found inconsistencies with his statements.
Mark. All right.
Sergeant Robert Moore of the Nashville Police Department took part in the search.
He said she took her clothes with her. The closet was so full of clothes you couldn't put another blouse in it. There was no room for anything else. Dresser drawers, her clothes are gone, but yet every drawer was full. I mean, it just didn't look like somebody had moved out.
Though Billy couldn't explain the discrepancy, he insisted that he would never hurt his wife, and he certainly had nothing to do with her murder. He agreed to let forensic technicians process his living room. Luminol was applied to the floor. But investigators found no traces of blood or any other signs of violence. But there were indications that the residence had been thoroughly cleaned recently.
I think we bring the house light
Despite
on.
the lack of evidence, investigators suspected that Billy Leslie was hiding something. Police began interviewing friends and neighbors. One neighbor claimed that Billy and Sandra fought often. Just a few days before Sandra disappeared, she heard what she described as a knockdown, drag-out fight coming from outside her window. When she looked outside, she saw Billy screaming at Sandra. As the fight escalated, Billy became physically abusive toward his wife. The neighbor didn't recall seeing Sandra after that night. She just assumed Sandra had finally decided to leave Billy. Perhaps that's exactly what Billy Leslie wanted everyone to believe.
Come in, just have a
One of
seat here,
Sandra's
if you will,
friends told police that Sandra had recently filed for divorce, and as a result, Billy had become increasingly violent toward her.
I think, first of all,
So much so that just before her death, Sandra decided to change the beneficiary of her life insurance policy.
We're working with the people in Decatur, Alabama. Billy?
Prior to the change, Billy Leslie stood to gain $150,000 from Sandra's death.
She had feared for her life, and she changed the beneficiary of that insurance policy to her brother in California, and specifically asked him to make sure her children were taken care of should anything happen to her.
In the same area.
Billy wasn't informed that he was no longer the beneficiary. For investigators, a possible motive for murder was beginning to emerge. Billy Leslie, as far as he knew, had a lot to gain from his wife's death. But so far, their case was only circumstantial. Later that evening, police obtained a warrant to search Billy's car, possibly used to transport Sandra's body to Alabama. Luminol was applied to the trunk. Investigators found an overwhelming amount of substance that appeared to be blood. Billy Leslie explained he had gone fishing recently and put his catch into the trunk. The trunk mat was collected and sent back to the Decatur Crime Lab for a more thorough forensic examination. While waiting for the test results, investigators continued to build their case. Hoping to find witnesses that could put Billy near the crime scene, police released details of the murder to the media in Alabama. A few days later, the tactic paid off. A Decatur resident remembered having a conversation with a man at a convenience store a few hours before Sandra's body was discovered.
And so I gave
He had asked where to find a good fishing spot. The woman directed him to an area half a mile away. It was the same location where the victim was found.
What time of day?
She was shown a photo lineup.
Well, I was in the convenience store at 3 in the morning on Saturday.
She had no idea who the suspect on the photo lineup was, but she was able to immediately point to Billy Leslie and say, "This is the guy. This is the guy that was here," and asked me about a place to fish.
The witness testimony put Billy Leslie just a half a mile away from the crime scene on the day of the murder, and investigators had no doubt that he was responsible for his wife's death. Now, they hoped the crime lab would provide irrefutable proof. Authorities were closing in on Billy Leslie, the man they believed responsible for the decapitation of his wife, Sandra. Though their case was largely circumstantial, they hoped a trunk mat collected from the suspect's car could physically link him to the homicide. After serological tests determined that the blood found on the trunk mat was not fish blood, as Billy Leslie claimed, Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences trace analyst John Kilborn began analyzing dozens of hairs and fibers recovered from the mat. Using a comparison microscope, he began looking for common characteristics between samples from the trunk mat and those recovered from the clothes Sandra Leslie had been wearing. The color, texture, and cross-sectional shape of the fibers matched.
We found a number of fibers from the victim's clothing that were consistent to the some of the known fibers from the trunk mat, as well as some foreign fibers that were in the trunk mat. So we were able to show a link between the fibers and the hairs out of the vehicle to the victim herself.
Sandra Leslie's body had been in the trunk of that car. And the only other person known to have driven the vehicle was her husband, Billy. Billy Leslie was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Sandra. Police theorized that Billy Leslie believed he had much to gain from killing his wife before their divorce was finalized. On July 4th, 1988, after a heated argument, Billy made the decision to kill his wife. After strangling Sandra, he loaded her into the trunk of their car and set out to dispose of the body on the banks of the Tennessee River in Decatur, Alabama. Not realizing that her fingerprints were on file with the military, Billy believed that separating the head from the body would make identification impossible. In December of 1989, Billy Wayne Leslie was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Even in death, Sandra Leslie managed to leave behind clues that pointed to her killer's identity. But in some cases, investigators have no idea where the evidence will lead them. The quiet, middle-class neighborhood of Lake Grove, New York, is a haven of suburban life. The community's illusion of serenity, however, was unable to provide protection from tragedy. On April 7, 1994, police and paramedics were dispatched to the home of 47-year-old Stuart Kovacs. Kovacs said that Irene, his wife of more than 20 years, was inside, dead. He believed she had killed herself by jumping off the second-floor balcony. Not wanting to contaminate the scene, the officer allowed only one paramedic into the house. Inside, 45-year-old Irene Kovacs' lifeless body was lying on the floor, covered with a towel. Her hair was wet, indicating she had recently showered. The paramedic noted bruising on the victim and a cut lip. An empty container of gasoline additive lay nearby. A large quantity of the substance was found pooled in the victim's mouth. It appeared that Irene Kovacs had poisoned herself and then jumped or fell from the second-floor balcony. Stuart Kovacs said that while working in the garage, he cut himself on a power tool. Going inside to get a Band-Aid, he discovered his wife on the floor. Panicked, he called 911 and then went upstairs to the bedroom to get a towel to cover her and to clean up his wound. On the couple's bed, he discovered a suicide note tucked underneath the family Bible. As a matter of routine protocol, homicide investigators were dispatched to the scene. Armed with a video camera, the team made their way into the residence. Almost immediately, they were struck by the victim's appearance. Lieutenant John Girash of the Suffolk County Police Department explains.
It's somewhat unusual that a woman would want herself to be discovered not dressed. In and of itself, that is not proof of anything other than suicide, but it is one of the circumstances that we take into account as we investigate.
After removing the body, police continued examining the scene. On the second-floor landing, they found a piece of recently dented sheetrock on the wall about ankle height, as though it had recently been kicked in anger, or perhaps a struggle. Unsure of its significance, the area, along with the rest of the scene, was thoroughly photographed. A short while later, after learning of his mother's death, the Kovacs' 19-year-old son came in to speak with detectives. He said that the situation at home had grown tense in recent months.
It was just, he had probable cause to think so. He found it.
His parents' divorce was due to be finalized soon, and his dad had become increasingly abusive, often exploding into a rage over nothing. In one recent incident, Stuart Kovacs returned home early from work and confronted Irene with a note he had found that had been sent to her by a business associate. Though Irene denied any wrongdoing, Stuart accused her of having an affair and began threatening her with violence. Suffolk County homicide detective Robert Doyle.
The Kovacs children indicated to us that there was a very, very poor relationship at home, that apparently Irene Kovacs was in tremendous fear of Stu Kovacs. He abused her mentally, probably more so than physically. It was a real hellish situation to be children in that particular home.
The son added that on the night before his mother's death, she had seemed normal and happy, not at all depressed or suicidal. For investigators, the routine suicide investigation had raised more questions than answers. Irene Kovacs just didn't seem a likely candidate for suicide. Now, police realized that the circumstances surrounding this tragedy demanded a closer look. Though it appeared that 45-year-old Irene Kovacs had poisoned herself and then jumped off the second-floor balcony of her home, police in Lake Grove, New York were not convinced. A few hours after her body was discovered, police returned to the residence with a warrant. Now they were searching for evidence that Irene's husband, Stuart Kovacs, had murdered her. Forensic examiner Robert Jenna was asked to assist in the search.
The fact that we have somebody claiming that this is a suicide, the husband, and the pieces of the puzzle just don't seem to fit a suicide, you now have to focus strongly on the physical evidence to try to either show that it was in fact a suicide or show that it was in fact something other than a suicide.
To disprove the suicide story, police searched for evidence of a violent struggle. And though Kovacs blamed a deep cut to his finger on a power tool accident, police speculated it could also be explained by a blow to a sharp object, like a tooth. But traces of Stuart Kovacs' blood were found exactly where he insisted the accident took place. The search continued inside the home. In the couple's second-floor bathroom, police found traces of blood on the commode lid. A washcloth found in the sink also appeared to be blood-stained. Kovacs said the blood had come from his injured finger. Investigators collected the evidence. In the bedroom, an officer recovered the suicide note found earlier by Stuart Kovacs. Even though the writing was identified as Irene's, a close inspection of the language caught investigators' attention.
What he purported to be a suicide note was in fact some writings of Irene Kovacs that really had nothing to do with suicide at all. She was talking about her life, she was talking about various things that she was going through personally in her life. At no point did that particular note indicate or suggest that she was going to commit suicide.
Unsure what to make of the evidence, police hoped Irene herself could give them answers. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was blunt force trauma to Irene's head and chest. But he could not rule out that the injuries occurred as a result of the fall from the second floor. Blood and tissue samples were collected and forwarded to the Suffolk County Crime Lab. There, toxicologists began analyzing the samples for the presence of the alcohol methanol, the main compound used in gasoline additives like the one Irene allegedly swallowed. First, examiners analyzed Irene's blood samples by using a gas chromatograph, an apparatus that separates complex mixtures into individual compounds. The analysis of the blood confirmed that fatal amounts of methanol were present. Toxicologist Ed Briglia of the Suffolk County Crime Lab continued the analysis on the tissue samples.
Subsequent to that finding, we analyzed other specimens that we received, primarily gastric contents, intestinal contents, and esophageal contents. Those specimens revealed no methanol to be present, which was totally contrary to the notion that Mrs. Kovacs could have consumed methanol shortly before her death. The reason this is the case is that it takes a period of time, anywhere from a minimum of approximately 1 hour upwards to approximately 4 to 5 hours, for the alcohol to be removed from the stomach.
For methanol to be found in the blood but not in the tissues told examiners that the gas additive had been absorbed through Irene's skin, not ingested through her mouth. She never swallowed the gas additive. To make sense of the findings, police turned back to forensic examiner Robert Jenna. Using photographs and diagrams from the scene, Jenna found a clue. There were portions of Irene's body lying underneath the second floor landing. It was unlikely that she came to rest in that position after falling over the railing. And Stuart Kovacs claimed he never touched Irene's body. And there was something else. One of the photographs revealed that the gas additive stains on the floor formed an outline of Irene's body.
In order to get this type of pattern, the victim would have to have been lying down in this position when the material was deposited on her, as opposed to her falling from the top landing, already having the material in her system. So it was consistent with her being in this position, lying on her back, the liquid deposited on her face and body, causing this outline that led us to believe that this particular case was not a suicide, but a homicide. The outline that was
coupled with the toxicologist's findings, the evidence showed that the gas additive had been poured into Irene's mouth while she was already dead or dying on the floor. To make their case, police still needed proof of a struggle. Examiners performed DNA tests on the various blood samples collected from the couple's bathroom, believed to have been left by Stuart's cut finger. But the analysis disproved Stuart Kovacs' story. All of the blood found in the bathroom had come from Irene. That proved that she had been bleeding prior to the fall from the balcony. For investigators, it was proof that Irene Kovacs had not taken her own life, but that Stuart Kovacs had taken it from her. With a warrant in hand, police quickly tracked down Stuart Kovacs as he returned home from work. He was taken into custody and booked for murder. Investigators believe that after beating Irene as she got out of the shower, Stuart Kovacs forced her over the balcony. After pouring the gas additive into her mouth to make her death look like a suicide, he smeared blood from a cut sustained during the assault on the power tool in the garage. On December 17, 1996, Stuart Kovacs was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Some killers will stop at nothing to conceal their crimes.
These are the...
When there are no human observers to a murder, investigators must look for a different kind of witness to reveal a killer's identity. They turn to the crime lab, where forensic examiners can uncover the truth by turning the smallest clue into a silent witness.